We would meet with the White House once a week to go through the variety of issues. When you watch TV, you see the congressperson or you see the senator, or you see the U.S. Secretary of Education. There's a whole team of people that are meeting behind the scenes.
Welcome back to Educator University. Ever wonder what it's really like to lead a school system or make decisions that impact thousands of classrooms? Today, we're joined by Dr. James Lane, a former state superintendent and senior advisor at the Department of Education. He's here to pull back the curtain on leadership at the top and explore how teachers and leaders can better understand and support each other. Welcome, Dr. James Lane.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Thank you for having me today.
It's great to have you. Kind of just diving into the first conversation, I think it is pretty unique opportunity to talk to someone at your level who's really experienced so much of education. You started as a teacher and then you moved into different levels of leadership. And I think as a teacher, we're just always curious, what's something that would surprise us as being in that top level leadership that we wouldn't know about what happens up there?
Yeah, well, and first thing I'll say is to all the teachers out there, I still feel like a teacher every day. I was a band director and yeah, I've been able to have some cool experiences in the policy world for sure. But, I think it's always important to have teacher voice as we're making decisions, of course, parent voice and others, all stakeholders really. But the question about what might surprise you, I think the biggest thing is that I find that decisions aren't made in a vacuum. And maybe the better way of me saying this is, it's not like there's one person making the decision. It's actually, I read a book way back about the tangled web of school governance or something like that. And when you're in those roles, whether it was my role as state superintendent or as the acting assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Ed, I got to experience that kind of web of decision making. And so as state superintendent, as an example, in Virginia, that role is a constitutional officer and was the leader of the Virginia Department of Ed. But, we had a board of education that was appointed by the governor that we had to respond to as it related to regulatory matters. And then we had the legislature who would pass bills and direct the department to do certain things. And then my position was appointed by the governor. And so we had the governor's administration and his priorities at the time that we had to sort through. And so it's the way that decisions are made, it's not like a straight arrow. Here, Mr. Superintendent, is the decision you need to make. How would you make it? This is what the legislature said we had to do. And then this is what we think the board will support from a regulatory standpoint. This is what we think the governor wants in terms of the priorities from his side. And then, of course, it's working with teachers associations and principal associations and superintendents associations and parent associations. And all of those folks really have a voice in it. And there's opportunity for public comment. And we always like to make sure we're responding to public comment and that our decisions are responsive to the feedback that we get. And so the biggest thing I'd say that you'd be surprised to know is that there's really a lot that goes into those final decisions before they actually get enacted in policy, and then you feel it in the classroom. From my standpoint, I always felt like my role was to be the advocate for students, and that, that no matter what was happening, maybe in the politics of the legislature or, the governor and the board, and just trying to make sure that anything that I was recommending was aligned to what I thought was going to make kids' outcomes and their lives better.
And I think that's a powerful place to come from as a leader, because whether you're a teacher or an administrator all the way to the top, we're all thinking about the student experience and their success. That's all we all have the same goal. And I think coming back to that is such a huge piece of finding unity in kind of what we do. And I think one of the things as being a teacher is that we're kind of in the classroom every day, all day. And I think as you move into administration, you have a little less of that. And I'm kind of curious how you navigated that as you moved up in terms of staying grounded and staying connected to the students, like you said, and to the teachers.
Yeah, well, whether it was district superintendent, state superintendent, or even federal leader, I made it an absolute priority of mine to stay very grounded and to be in the classrooms. When I was a district superintendent, some of the districts I led had 3 schools. I tried to be in every school every single day, right? And go visit classrooms and talk with teachers and sit in their PLC meetings or in their faculty meetings and make sure I was abreast of the issues. But also it was important to me, especially in those smaller communities, everybody knows everybody in a community of 1,200 kids. And my first district as superintendent had 1,200 kids, which is less kids than my daughter's elementary school she went to a few years ago. And so that's one way that I tried to stay grounded, is I just always wanted to be ever present as another opportunity for support for our teachers. When I got to the state level and I was the state superintendent, I had that same mentality. I made a commitment as state superintendent that I would visit every single school district in Virginia while I was state superintendent. And I did that. And that was in the middle of COVID even, when we were trying to reopen schools and there was hesitancy and all that, I was out there going to school districts that were opening, visiting their classrooms and showing folks that, there were ways to do this within the, CDC rules or whatever rules were coming down from the state health department. And then when I got to the federal level, it was the same thing. I can remember one of my first visits. I was the acting assistant secretary over the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed, and we had a team that worked with school districts when they had crises. And there was a situation in Kentucky where they had a massive flood that flooded several schools. They had to close schools for a while, and we wanted to be one of the first groups on the ground there, so they knew, hey, there are federal resources to support you. Unfortunately, we also have school shootings. We tried to be responsive in those situations. We had hurricanes in Puerto Rico. We tried to be responsive in those situations, and so where it aligned to my role, I always tried to make it a priority to know what's actually going on and be there in person so that I can help make the best decisions with all those decision makers we talked about before.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of example to have in leadership is to constantly be connected. I think as teachers, sometimes we may not see it. I think it's good to hear that you're doing that because sometimes we don't see it, right? We're in our classrooms, we not see you come up to our schools, but you actually are there. I think a lot of our admin are actually in the high levels in our schools. We probably don't see it, and so it's nice to hear that that's happening at even the federal level. You're kind of making that connection with us, so
Yeah.
that feels good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somewhat curious on that, as someone with lots of classroom experience, how did you feel when your superintendent or, school board member or whoever came to your classroom or maybe even just your principal that, at least from my experience, a lot of the teachers were really excited because they knew that people cared about what you were doing. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, yeah, I tell everyone, I'm like, "Come to my classroom. Come in. Come see what I'm doing." I've been teaching for 15 years, so I'm just like, "Come and see what I'm doing. Come learn if you wanna learn from me or tell me what you want ideas you have for me." So, yeah, I love having other adults just kinda stop by and see what I'm doing because 'cause I'm kind of a lot of us are kind of in our own little vacuum most of the day, which is amazing too. We do this for the kids, we do this for students, but it's also nice to get a little interaction every so often and see just get some feedback. So, yeah, it felt good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good.
for sure, yeah. I think that, I'm just always curious too how things are happening, like, especially at the federal level, I just am like, "Wow, how do things happen?" Are there things that you could share with us? I know probably there's certain things you have to keep to yourself, but I just think as the teacher, I'm curious, at the federal level, are there things that you're doing that people would be interested like, would be something that you want us to understand about how things are functioning up there or how things work in that kinda bigger sphere of education?
Yeah. And, I went into a little bit more detail about how it worked at the state with the legislature and the board. At the federal level, it's similar but not the same. On a weekly basis, I would be in meetings with staff from the appropriations committees of both sides of Congress. And there would be, the I think at one point the Democrats were in charge in one side, so they had the chair, but then we would also meet with the ranking members, which was, in that case, the Republican Party leadership. And then when it flipped, then we met with the Republican chairs and the ranking members on both sides. But that appropriations team we met with, we would then have a similar and almost replicated meeting with what's called the authorizers, which are the folks that actually, don't focus as much on the appropriations and the dollars, but actually the policy enactment that comes from that. We would meet with the White House once a week to go through the variety of issues that we were talking about and getting their perspective on it. And then we would have internal U.S. Department of Education meetings. And then all the while, all those same type of stakeholder meetings. We're meeting with parents, we're meeting with principals, we're meeting with teachers, we're meeting with superintendents, so on and so forth, and state superintendents, of course, and to try to navigate all that. But the other part that's really interesting about the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed is we're in charge of all of the title programs when I was there. And then we layered on top of that, we also were managing all of the COVID relief dollars with ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3, which was really a generationally huge amount of money, $130 billion in ESSER 3 that expired on September 30th of 2024. Well, during the 4 years that administration was there, we were very focused on making sure that those dollars were spent wisely and thinking through with Congress and with congressional members or their staff, I would say, and the White House folks on how to do that. And that, there's a whole, when you watch TV, you see the congressperson or you see the senator, or you see the president or you see the U.S. Secretary of Education. There's a whole team of people that are meeting behind the scenes to, resolve the big questions in policy. And then when we put that out to the world, there's opportunities for public comment and we respond to that just like at the state level and try to make changes to our regulatory efforts based on the feedback that we get back. And then of course it becomes approved. And then there's a whole communications effort because once something gets passed in Washington, unless it makes big news, Yeah, we can post it on our website or even talk about it in social, but it's really important to make sure that teachers on the ground and principals on the ground and superintendents know these policy shifts and what goes on. And then there's all other kinds of factors that filter into federal policy. But when your state, builds your state assessment system that students take in grades 3 through 8, and reading and math and science, and then replicated similarly in high school at least one time, those assessments have to go through a federal peer review process. And so the reason I mentioned the title programs before is because Title One really governs what happens when an assessment and accountability. And so when your states submit those assessments, we run a massive peer review process to make sure it's actually aligned to your standards, that it's criterion referenced, that it meets federal law. And so there's just all kinds of process that goes on behind the scenes. Probably one of the funnier stories, or I don't know if funny is the right word, but one of the things that I didn't expect when I got there was, because all of these people want to weigh in, there's a massive clearance process where the staff within the U.S. Department of Education, there's politically appointed staff like I was, and then there's career staff who are there regardless of who the president is or regardless of who the U.S. Secretary of Education is. And so that staff usually takes the first crack at developing the policy that may need to go forward, or the response to a peer review or something like that. And then that makes it to, say, the assistant secretary level. Well, then I'll either sign off or approve it or push back for more feedback or whatever. But that clearance process goes through multiple layers. It then goes into the secretary's office, and then it goes into the White House Domestic Policy Council, and then it goes to the OMB. And if at any point somebody doesn't like something you did, they push it all the way back down the chain and it goes back up. And so there's just a lot of eyes and a lot of process. Some would say sometimes overly bureaucratic, but it really makes it so that you really work hard on those teams to make sure you don't miss something or have a misstep or an issue that could cause major issues on the ground for schools. And one of the things I liked about me being in that role, and the nominee for that in the current administration is the state superintendent in North Dakota right now, having an educator in that role that really knows schools and classrooms and parents and teachers and have worked in that environment is really important. And historically, administrations have tried to have an educator in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education leading those roles because it has so much impact on the classroom.
Yeah, that touch point is very important, I think, to have someone in education who has had that really deep experience. So, yeah, I think as you're talking about all this red tape, that's maybe the wrong word. A lot of just like levels that need to be covered before things can move forward. I think as teachers, sometimes we think, I'd like this changed or that changed, but like, wow, there's so much that has to happen at like multiple levels, whether it's at the school, like superintendent level, or at the state level. In terms of being a teacher, maybe teachers are listening thinking, I want this to change in education. Are there things that they could do to communicate that to the administration and to leadership in a way that is like we're all on the same team, like you mentioned before, we're all here for the students. So like, how do we communicate that in a way that works well with you or
Yeah,
that?
that's
Yeah.
actually a really great question. I'll highlight one point and then I'll answer that. And that another piece of that that's important to remember is, because a lot of the work that happens in government comes either from the state legislature or from Congress, there's actually probably less flexibility than most people perceive in terms of what you're actually able to do. A lot of the most difficult questions I actually got, whether it was from teachers or principals, superintendents, parents, whatever, actually were questions about a nuance of the policy that was mandated under the law. And we actually didn't have a lot of flexibility to change it. There's always questions of, could you interpret it differently and all that? And we always tried to interpret it with what we thought Congress intended, no matter who was in charge in Congress, because we know that ultimately it was their decision. Your question was about, if you're a teacher in the classroom and I don't like something that I'll even start at this, district level, my district is doing, or my state or even federal, the most important thing is to raise your voice. It's the best part about, freedom of speech and the First Amendment in America, is that, you do have the opportunity to ask questions of decision makers in your government. But the nuance of that I would say is, make sure you're communicating those issues to the right folks. If you don't like something that's written into the law, then your local legislator is probably your best first tactic, whether that is the person that represents you in your general assembly or legislature, or whether that's your local congressperson that represents you in Washington, or even your senator. And I have found that when I reached out to congressional offices more from a district level standpoint or even a citizen standpoint, they will be responsive. Now, you may not meet the congressperson yourself every single time. Many times you will, but you'll certainly meet a person on the staff that has heavy influence of that. And so, when it comes to legislative or congressional issues, I would reach out directly to the offices of the folks that represent you in your local school community. When it comes to your school board, I mean, I I would sit on the dais as superintendent with the entire school board, and folks would come make public comment, and we always loved hearing from our teachers. We loved hearing from everyone, but when our teachers spoke, we would pay special attention because you were the ones caring for our students on a day-to-day basis in the classroom, and your perspective on that was really important to us. And school board members, more so than any level of government I've worked in, are very responsive to the local community, because when you speak to your school board member, sometimes in small communities, you can get elected to school board with like hundreds of votes. And that one voice to your school board member is representative of a much higher percentage of the constituency than when you get to higher levels of government. But I found that to be true at the next layers too. Legislative folks that are working in Virginia, we call it the House of Delegates. They're representing a very nuanced and small territory of your state, and they want to know what people in their community feel when they're making decisions. And so reaching out to them is important. And then the same is true at the state board of ed level, which is when it's not legislative and it's more regulatory, or it's a decision that the department can make. The state board of education has a lot of constitutional authority over those things. And usually states have 7 to 9 members. And so, these are real citizens volunteering their time, and they want to make the best decision, and they want to hear from you. And then when you get to the federal level, it can obviously feel really complex and really massive and all of that. But it's the same type of thing. The person that represents the first district of Virginia where I live, if you call their office, you're going to get a response. And then the same is true of the U.S. Department of Education. We would get thousands of public comments on certain nuances of what we were doing. There's someone who actually goes through and each of one of those comments, and whether you get a direct response, there's at least an affirmation, usually in my experience. I don't know all how that works necessarily, but I would get summaries of all the public comments and all the responses and everyone that came in. And then from that, we would, make sure that we looked at what was in our policy package and make sure that we considered changes based on that. And that filters up. So the biggest piece is reach out to the people, make sure you know who the right person is to advocate to, obviously, for the change that you want, or maybe the thing that you don't like that you just want to comment on. But, your voice matters, and that's probably the most important piece of what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you going into detail about that because as teachers, I think that one of the points of this conversation is to kind of pull back that curtain and help people connect more. I think there's kind of some of this disconnect, and I wanted to make sure we create that connection for people to realize, like you said, I think you said it well, that people need to find the right person, our teachers need to find that right person, and then, go for it. Start using their voice in a way that's positive and really is helpful in this situation. So,
Yeah, and you never know what comes of that conversation. I mean, there are folks that reached out to my school board because they didn't like a singular decision they made, but they gave really insightful feedback, and the board really appreciated it. And the next thing you know, they're asking that person to be on committees and have more influence, and then you're part of the policy committee and you're part of the decisions that they're making. And so I think that's really important piece. And you never know what that one public comment you submitted might turn into in terms of how your advocacy for kids can be helpful.
yeah, and I think, as teachers, we have kind of our concerns and our thoughts, but you kind of touched a little bit about the things that you go through as a leader and that you went through, the constraints you had, things like that. Are there things that you would want teachers to help us understand you better in terms of the things that are challenging for you in terms of the position you're in?
Yeah, well, so our administration ended, and now I'm in the private sector, and so I've served in 2 different roles since I left government. I was the CEO of PDK International, which is one of the largest and oldest associations that supports educators. And many of you have probably read Kaplan Magazine. PDK puts out Kaplan Magazine. And then many of you probably know Educators Rising, which is the high school program that encourages high school students to consider education as a career. And so I really, after I got out of government service, I decided to focus on the teacher pipeline and the teacher shortage. And so from PDK, I'm now at ETS, where I lead the team that does student assessment for ETS. As an example, we lead the California state assessment system for California. We also run Praxis, which in 43 states is the assessment we all had to take to become teachers. You're not in one of our 43 states. There every state has a version of that assessment. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking now, what do we need to do to eliminate the teacher pipeline besides pay? Pay is obviously the most important thing. We've got to compensate people so that they want to be in the field and stay in the field for 30 plus years. Beyond that, how can we improve teacher quality? How can we improve teacher retention? How can we think about new recruitment strategies? That's where I spend a lot of my time. So your question around how teachers can help, one of the most important things for me as I've moved more into the nonprofit side of the education world is making sure, much like when I was a superintendent visiting classrooms, that I stay grounded. And so, one of the things we always look for is for teachers to share with us their experiences with the things we do, whether it's Educators Rising at PDK or Praxis at ETS or student assessment, because, we obviously work with our states who are, the folks that hire us to do this work, but ultimately we want to make sure that we're providing tools that can improve outcomes in the classroom. And so, anytime a teacher wants to have a conversation with me, just reach out to me on the socials because we always want to stay on top of your needs in the classroom.
Yes, love it. And James, I'm going to give you a little feedback right now because, fun fact, the reason I'm a teacher is because senior year in high school, I took a course. I don't think I'm a little older, so I don't think it was your course exactly, but it was similar to Educators Rising, where I did a year in my senior year of classes in how to be a teacher. And then I also did practicums throughout that year. So there you go. I think it's definitely effective, definitely an effective strategy for sure. So I wouldn't be here without it. I appreciate
One of my
that. You
favorite
can
parts about that job at PDK was meeting the students that wanted to be future educators like you were back in the day. And now that Educators Rising thing has grown massively. And I don't work there anymore, but I'll put in a plug for them. They host a national conference every summer, and 3,500 high school students that want to become teachers go to that. And I'm telling you, there's no experience in my life than standing on the stage in front of 3,500 students that want to be teachers and their excitement about it. It really gives you hope for the future of teaching and learning in America for sure.
I'm getting to the age, and it's kind of a strange age where some of my students can now be teachers as well, almost. And it is kind of crazy to think that full circle moment of seeing your students become teachers. And yeah, it really is. I can imagine being in front of that stage would be such an incredible experience. So
Yeah.
yeah.
You're talking about your former students being teachers now. One of my former students is actually the high school band director at the high school that my middle school fed into. And, he's doing a great job there and was one of my best players. He was a trombone player back in the day. And it's just so exciting to see, I was a band director, I was a music teacher. One of the proudest things that I can experience as a teacher is that a kid ends up going into the field that was my field, right? And that to see my former students becoming band directors, it's probably one of the most proud parts of my career.
For sure. Yeah. I have to ask you what instrument you play in the band because I was actually a band member as well.
Yeah, what did you play?
Clarinet.
Okay, well, I was a trumpet player, and so obviously played all through the end of elementary school, middle school, high school. Played in the college band at UNC Chapel Hill, and the experience that I had is I can remember my freshman year band director coming to me and saying, you know, I think you'd be a great band director. You should consider majoring in music. I was thinking I'd major in business or something like that, or law, or whatever. And I got into the music major and started working with kids, and it changed my life, and I'm so glad that I did. But yeah, I was a trumpet player and I played music for a living for a little bit after college. And eventually, as I was getting closer to getting married, my wife said, you know what, probably time to come off the road. And that's when I put that teaching degree to work and have never looked back. Just loved working with kids.
Love it. Yeah, yeah, and I think we've kind of touched a little bit. I was gonna ask a question about your current work, but you kind of already shared a little bit about that. Is there anything else that you wanna share about how your previous experience in the public sector has kinda contributed to your vision and your current work in what you do now?
Yeah, a lot actually. So, I mentioned that we run state assessment for students in some areas and the teacher assessments when it comes to certification. We're also launching a lot of new and innovative work around how we might measure student skills. There's a lot of districts and states thinking about profiles of a graduate and, developing student creativity and critical thinking and communication and collaboration. So, one of the cool things about my role and one of the reasons I came to ETS is I think this is going to be a very unique time with innovating assessment, and AI is changing a lot. And so, one of the things I'm really excited to be thinking about right now is, where is it appropriate to use AI in schools and with students and assessments? And how can it better help us hone in on, say, a student's zone of proximal development so that we can give better information to teachers as they're supporting students? And so for me, there's certainly the work that we have done historically in assessments, but I really think we're on the edge of a major time in innovation, which is really important with NAEP scores, which you've probably seen a lot in the news being way down, and student performance still not really recovering from COVID. There's a need for us to make sure that we're holding a high bar for students and that we have high standards for students. But at the same time, we ought to think about, as these new tools proliferate and we can get more and better information about students, how can we in the assessment world be thinking about that and making sure that it's actually helpful to teachers and students as they grow in their education careers?
Yeah, if the data could actually serve students for their current learning to help them see their spots they can grow at for the future year and not just be kind of a cumulative thing. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you say in a way?
Yeah, I mean, when a lot of these assessments proliferated, especially 25 years ago, right about the time that No Child Left Behind and all that happened, the idea was that it would be a diagnostic so that we could peer in and see which schools were struggling with students and which schools were doing really well with students, so we could learn from the schools that were doing really well and replicate that in other areas. And then the schools that were struggling, the idea was that this would allow us to then flood resources to those schools to get them what they needed to make sure they were making a difference with students. And ultimately, what happened with assessment accountability is it tended to focus more on the accountability side and holding schools accountable. But from my perspective as an educator, we really should still be using it diagnostically to make better decisions. And one of the complaints about annual assessment has been, well, it's at the end of the year. It's a quote unquote autopsy of what happened, and it really doesn't drive instruction. And so, what are things that we can do in the future to give teachers more timely information throughout the school year, not just on end of year assessments? I still think a lot of important decisions can be made from end of year assessments. And I think that it does still help us hone in on where we need to grow the most. But I think that what's going to happen with AI and all of what we're learning with assessment is we're going to have so much more timely feedback to be able to act on to make a better difference with our students.
Yeah, and that's very helpful to hear as a teacher because I do think sometimes when you take a test at the end of the year, you don't get the scores. So for a while there, I was doing language learning for students who were learning English, and I would take a test, in March or April, and I wouldn't get the scores till June. And it's like, well, at that point, it's really good for the following year, but yeah, it is kind of hard to use that data to really help you as a teacher if you don't have them the following year. So I absolutely makes a lot of sense. So yeah. Any final thoughts that we haven't yet covered that you wanna share with teachers about this conversation?
Well, one thing that is top of mind, I can't remember if I mentioned before, but I recently wrote a book about my experience in school leadership, and I tell some stories about what it was like being state superintendent and working at the federal level as well. But the book I wrote is called "Leading with Laser Focus" and the 7 steps to success in our schools. And one of the things that I tried to lay out there is it really is an expansion of that conversation we just had about assessment and making it more useful. And I had some situations as a principal where I walked in and some of the subject areas in my school had pass rates like in the 50s. And then other subjects in my school had pass rates in the 90s. So that let me know, okay, this isn't maybe an issue around whether the students can do what we need. In fact, I've always been a growth mindset person. I believe that students can do anything we want them to do. But when I that's a great example of how I use diagnostics. And I said, okay, what is it that's happening in this subject area that's different than all the others that's impacting us? And over the years, I kind of honed that in as I worked with schools that struggled with students towards a 7-step process that I believed was necessary to get the outcomes that we wanted with students. And I won't walk through all 7 of the steps today, but what I'll say is what I try to show in this book is the best schools in America, and I've been lucky enough to have that kind of national vantage point, are the schools that do one piece of that uniquely better than others. And that is when that school, from whether it's the custodian or the paraprofessional to the, our front desk person to the teachers to the assistant principals to the principals, when every single, and parents, I would add to that, when every single person in that school community knows what will happen at a school at the moment that a student starts to show failure, and then they act on those plans that they have in place. When that happens really well, that's when we see those anomalies where you see schools that traditionally have underperformed breaking the norm and making a huge difference with students. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is how to, structure that and the book is more written for maybe teacher leaders and principals than it is for even federal leaders and some of the other experiences I've had. But it's kind of like a step-by-step guidebook for, okay, if you want to have a school community that feels like that, where everyone knows how we're going to make a difference with kids, here are some structures that you can put in place to make a difference there. And that's the one thing I would say, is that sometimes when we're working in schools and a student doesn't perform how we want to, that there's not a systemic way to respond to that. And the principal will go to the teacher and say, well, what did you do? Or what are you going to do next? Or what's the difference you're going to make with the kids? But often that's not the only answer to turning that kid's performance around. It is a school community approach. It is a whole school community approach, and that everyone has a role in making sure that students are successful. And if you're not intentional about that and you don't create structures for that, then it doesn't happen unless one person, like the teacher, takes on that initiative to do that extra piece. But we shouldn't be leaving that all up to one person. We have a lot of infrastructure in the school to make difference with kids. So let's make sure we set up systems to support our students. And that can be true of attendance, that can be true of discipline and behavior and classroom management, that can be true of student academic outcomes, it can even be true of maybe even the mental health supports that we want for our students. And so that's just one piece I would say, is that as a teacher, and I talk about this in the book, you may not feel empowered as a first-year teacher to make these type of decisions, but everyone should feel like they're a leader in the school, and that they can engage in the process that the school has set forward to make a difference for kids.
Yeah, that's such an important piece of that community aspect. It's not just one person, it's everybody, and everybody has such a chance to help the students and build that village. We talk about, raising children is like building that village around them to help them succeed. So, yeah, what a powerful message, and I'm sure we'll want to read your book and find more about you. I'll make sure to share it below, and I'll ask at the end where they can find you. Before we kind of do that, though, I always have some fun questions I ask my guests. I have 4 questions I always ask to get to know you a little better. The first question is your favorite teacher lunch.
It's like what I would eat at school for
Yeah.
lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I when I was a teacher, I ate in the cafeteria every day, and we were not mandated. I had duty-free lunch, which I think is super important for our teachers, by the way, principals that are listening. But I ate in the school cafeteria every day. I ate what the kids were eating, and I knew I wanted to be a principal, so part of me wanted to like understand every piece of this kid's perspective, so I could. I'll tell a quick funny aside. Every time I would meet with my student advisory group, they would want to talk about school lunch and how we can make school lunch better. And so I made a decision, well, you know what? I'm going to eat school lunch every day and understand. Now, I was lucky in Durham, North Carolina. Our food was good. And every Wednesday, we had fried chicken, buttered cabbage, macaroni and cheese, and then like a roll and maybe applesauce. But I'm telling you, the food in that school was so good, at least on Wednesdays. Like the school resource officers all over the district would come eat at our school. So my favorite lunch ever was that Wednesday, where it wasn't just me eating with the kids, which I did other days, but it was like the entire community came and wrapped around the kids because of that special lunch that we served the kids on Wednesdays.
Wow. It sounds delicious too. It's making me hungry thinking about
Not
it.
sure that same type of lunch is allowed under the new federal rules. I mean, 25 years later, they made all
Yeah.
kinds of changes, but I loved that lunch.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Your best behavior management tip as a teacher.
Get to really know your students. So many times from the principalship when I was dealing with a classroom management situation, oftentimes what got the kids to the principal's office was not the thing that they originally did. It's how they responded to this teacher addressing the issue that they did. And, I'm joking about this because there's probably a whole lot less of this these days, but I can remember that a kid would end up in my office for, talking back to a teacher, let's say, but it started with chewing gum. And like, I would talk to the kid, of course, because I wanted to make sure the kid behaved appropriately first. And I would say, how did you let chewing gum escalate to you getting in trouble? And it's not always chewing gum. They had their cell phone out, or, which are now being banned, of course, but, all those kind of things would filter into that. But so many incidents in school start with something super minor. And when I would ask the kids about it, often what they would say to me is, the kids talk about respect. You probably hear kids talk about respect all the time. I didn't feel respected in that moment, or something like that. And you know what? At the end of the day, I think it's important to respect our teachers regardless. But so what I did is I spent a lot of time teaching kids, how their teachers expected them to respond in those moments. And then when I had the opportunity to get with the teacher, sometimes the teacher escalated the situation too. You get tired, and 180 days of this, this kid got in trouble 2 or 3 days in a row, and this just got to a point. And so what I learned is the better we know our kids and what's behind their thinking and what's driving their, decision to do this thing that they did, it helps us to better respond to it. Doesn't mean that it won't end up in the principal's office sometimes either way, but I found that those teachers that really had strong relationships with their kids rarely ever had to send a kid to the office because they could resolve that between the teacher and the student. But what was born of that was that the teacher and the student knew each other well enough where there was a mutual respect that I know you care about me and I know you're just trying to make me better and this isn't just about getting me in trouble. And that's when it went really well. And at the same time, I believe that behavior is taught. So what, we always talk about the first day of school, which is, you got to set the expectations on day one. There used to be a joke, you don't smile until Thanksgiving or something like that. I don't remember the phrase, but maybe it was another holiday. But anyways, there's a little bit of that, but I don't know about not smiling till Thanksgiving. I want to see you smiling on day one. But what I do want is on day one that we've set the expectations for our students and not only told them what the expectations are, but actually taught them how to engage in the classroom and set the right tone for the year.
Yeah, great tip. High expectations, building relationships, such great things for behavior management. A teacher that made a difference in your life.
There's so many, but I always go back to my band directors because ultimately it's like that story I told about my former student. They're the ones that drove me into this career because I loved my band directors as a teacher. The and honestly, my college band director was a big one. I already told some stories there, but my high school band director was the same thing. There's a guy, Terry Blaylock. He was my band director my freshman and sophomore year of high school, went on into other things my junior and senior year. But later on in my career, I had the chance to play trumpet in Mr. Blaylock's band. That was one of like the biggest full circle moments for me that like now I'm a trumpet player that he respects professionally enough that I can play with him. But in the classroom, I can just remember he not only taught me how to play my instrument, he not only taught me a better appreciation of music, he not only taught me how to be a better student, but he taught me a lot about what it takes to become an adult or a man or whatever. He really, really cared about us as students. And I always tried to emulate the way I approached the classroom to the way Mr. Blaylock did.
A powerful story. Last little question here for fun is last lesson you taught.
Well, I'll take so I've done some university teaching since I got out of the K-12 experience. So I'll set the university stuff to the side. In a lot of ways, I feel like I teach lessons every day. I think that's important as a leader. That the teams we work with are largely trying to learn from us as well. But in the K-12 classroom, in my band directing experience in Durham, North Carolina, our principal at our school I was at a middle school. He was moved to the high school, and mid-year. And then one of the other assistant principals of my school became the principal. And so they made the decision to move me into an assistant principal role halfway through the year. Now, luckily, I had set it up because my band had gotten so large that I had an assistant director. So it was an easier transition because then the assistant director could take over for me. But my last lesson, as I recall, and it's been over 20 years now, but was my final December concert with my students. And the December concert is one of my favorite concerts as a band director because you still get to do a lot of the really fun music. I mean, there's holiday and December themed and winter themed music that we would do, and the kids loved that. And we would focus on multiple cultures and multiple genres during that time. By the time you get into the spring semester, it's like band competition and festival in March, and then you're going to other competitions. So, I took my kids to Disney World in the spring, and it's like a different world as you get into the second semester. But that first semester of middle school is also when you do sixth grade band. And as a band director, those kids came to you in August or September. They didn't even know how to hold the instrument. Some of them didn't even know how to read music yet. And you go from that moment of literally teaching them how to hold it and put it together and make their first note to they're playing their first concert in December. That is super special to me. And so my last lesson as a teacher was conducting those winter band programs with my older students, but also it's that concert for sixth graders is super special because it's the first time their parents have ever seen them.
Wow, what a moment. It's such progress to go from not holding an instrument to playing a song for the December concert. How fun. A good memory.
Yeah.
Dr. James Lane, thank you so much for sharing everything. You brought so much value, and I just know teachers are going to love hearing from you. You really came at this idea of leadership with such honesty and openness, and really helped us to create those bonds between leaders and teachers that needs to be there, I believe. So thank you so much for bringing value. And I think the question we're going to have is where can teachers find you? where's the best place they can get your book, things like that.
Yeah, well, my website is laserfocus.education, but you can find me on all the socials on Insta and X. It's at Dr. James Lane. On LinkedIn, it's the classic LinkedIn / James F. Lane. If you want to learn more about what we're working on, any of those are great ways to do it. But Annie, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.